Department. Thousands of people have taken to the streets in Algeria demanding fast political change, just hours after celebrating the decision by the country's president not to run for a fifth term in office. President Abdelaziz Bouteflika postponed next month's elections, but hasn't stepped down. He says polls will be held after a national conference and a referendum on a new constitution, but he hasn't given any dates. Well, Olivier Guitta is the managing director of Global Strat, which is a geopolitical risk and security consultancy firm, and he's also an expert on Algeria. I asked him why there'd been such a change in mood over the last 24 hours.
A couple of things. I mean, it was almost a given that Abdelaziz Bouteflika would withdraw his candidacy to its fifth mandate. People now realize that it's going to be business as usual until there's a real change within the real power behind Bouteflika, because Bouteflika has been incapacitated since 2013, and there's a clan, if you will, especially his brother Said, that is de facto running the country with the head of the army, Gaid Salah. So the people are now realizing that, you know, getting Bouteflika out of the running, if you will, is the first easy step. Then the second one would be to look at what's next. Are the people behind Bouteflika wanting to put together a scenario like in Egypt, for instance, and put somebody from the military in command in either transition posting before elections are set, or they're thinking about putting somebody else like Brahimi, that is very well known to the West, and that could be a transition figure. So I think we've seen just the beginning of demonstration in Algeria. For now, they're remaining peaceful, and hopefully that will stay that way. But the real battle, if you will, starts now, because the people that have much to lose are the people that have been effectively running the country behind Bouteflika, behind the scenes. And those people do not want to give up the power.
So the ordinary people have good grounds to be suspicious that somehow the cabal around Bouteflika are trying to cling on to power.
Exactly. It's been going on since 1962, and they've seen that time and again, the people that are around the party, the old guard, if you will, have had the power. The military has been in power, and that in the past 5 years, the people behind the regime got rid of some of the people that were not so much in tune with what they had in mind, especially the very powerful head of the security services, nicknamed Tufik, that was taken out of the power, and also a slew of generals. So there's been a lot of cleanup behind the scenes of people that were not considered as faithful to Bouteflika as his close circle.
We're seeing people, ordinary people, putting themselves on the line in these protests. Where is the opposition?
As all dictatorships, unfortunately, the opposition has been killed in the egg since 1962. I mean, this was, remember when it was won the war of against France, and France came out of Algeria. It was a Marxist regime with a unique party, and that party is still in charge now, almost 60 years after the fact. So we had no free elections basically in Algeria since 1962. So opposition doesn't exist. And that's what the main issue is going to be, and that's what they're going to play behind the scenes. The clique behind Bouteflika is, who do you want in power? Do you want the Islamists to be in power, or us? So there's always been this blackmail also during the civil war in the 1990s, where Bouteflika's regime was telling the French and the Americans, look, it's much better to stick with us, otherwise you'll have jihadists in power. Is that what you want? And if you can see how muted the reactions have been across the world, especially in France and the West, in terms of what's been happening, the last thing they would want is any kind of destabilization. And that's where the crux of the issue is going to be. And that's why demonstrators are going to be in a pickle, because down the road, the international community is going to put their nose in there and try to make sure that there's not going to be too much destabilization, especially after what happened with the Arab Spring in 2011-12.
Well, that's the point. The Arab Spring, of course, bypassed Algeria to a certain extent. At the moment, they're calling these protests the smiling revolution. But for how much longer will people keep smiling?
So there are a couple of things to remember. Algeria, compared to the other countries that went through the Arab Spring, had a very bloody civil war, as I mentioned, in the 1990s, that killed 150,000 people and that traumatized the country. And Salah, the head of the army, was also playing on this to say, look, if there's too much chaos, we could go back to a civil war. So they're using that as a pawn to scare off the population, of saying, look, we need some kind of harmony. We need to make sure that we're not going into a civil war again. That's one thing. But people are not stupid, obviously, and they're not going to fall into that trap. But the main issue is that there's no father figure, if you will. Your question on the opposition was exactly on target. There's no one really that can take the lead, if you will, of that movement and say, look, I'm going to run for elections. We don't even know when the elections are going to be held. We don't even know if they're going to be free. Most likely they won't. So a lot of things are in the pipe, and that's what I said. It could be a very long-term, protracted movement, but one day or another, unfortunately, it will have to turn violent.
And meanwhile, it is, as you've alluded to, the Western countries that are, maybe not directly, indirectly propping up this regime.
Yes, because of many reasons, in terms of, especially now in terms of the refugee, the immigration issue, but also in terms of terrorism, because, we cannot hide the fact that Algeria has the strongest army in Africa, and Algeria has been combating Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb very forcefully. The question is, do you take the risk of having Algeria become a Libya or a Mali, and then it can snowball and have an effect on Morocco and on Tunisia? And Morocco is 7 miles from Europe. So you have there the nightmarish scenario that Europeans are looking at in terms of security, refugee problems, and that's why they are all about stabilization, if you will.
Mr. Bouteflika is asking for a year in which he says he won't stand for re-election, but nevertheless, 12 months is a long time in politics. Don't need to tell you that. He's asking for a year where they can have a sort of national conversation and can re-examine the constitution. You've already outlined the suspicions that this is another sort of attempt to cling on to power. What happens after 12 months, and one way or another, after 12 months, do you expect there to, if it lasts that long, by the way, do you expect there to be some elections, and will they be what we would consider to be free and fair elections?
I mean, all will have to stand on what the people and the power of the streets will do, because more importantly, if it were to leave it to the so-called opposition that has been basically bought off by the regime as pawns, and the regime, that 1 year transition period is going to be just time to basically prepare for another candidate to take over from Bouteflika and from the same clan. So the main issue is people in the streets of Algiers have realized this, and what will they do? How will they get organized? How will they play against the regime? Will they get allies? Will they get money and support from from different groups or from abroad. The answer to your question is in the streets and how much this movement will have legs.
That's Olivier Guitta, who's the managing director of Global Strat, a geopolitical risk and security consultant firm.